Picture this. You're in a laboratory at Caltech in 1974. The most brilliant mind in physics is standing before a room full of graduating students, about to deliver what would become one of the most important warnings in the history of science. Richard Feynman steps up to the podium, his wild hair catching the California sunlight streaming through the windows, and he's about to reveal something that would shake the very foundation of how we think about knowledge itself. But this isn't just another lecture about quantum mechanics or electromagnetic theory. No, this is about something far more dangerous, far more insidious. This is about the enemy that lives inside every scientist's mind, the one that has derailed more research, corrupted more data, and destroyed more careers than any external force ever could. Feynman is about to talk about the most dangerous illusion in science, and the terrifying part is this. You're probably falling for it right now, at this very moment, without even realizing it. What Feynman discovered wasn't hidden in some complex equation or buried in experimental data. It was hiding in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of human psychology. It was the realization that every time we look at the world, every time we conduct an experiment, every time we analyze results, we're not just fighting against the mysteries of nature. We're fighting against ourselves. We're fighting against the most sophisticated, most convincing, most dangerous enemy we'll ever face. Our own mind's desperate need to be right, to find patterns where none exist, to see confirmation where there is only coincidence. The scene I described wasn't fictional. It really happened. Feynman really did stand before those students and deliver a warning that would echo through decades of scientific research. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. Despite his warning, despite his crystal-clear explanation of the problem, despite decades of scientific education since then, we're still falling for the exact same trap. Scientists are still fooling themselves. Researchers are still seeing what they want to see. And the price we pay for this illusion isn't just failed experiments or retracted papers. The price is progress itself. The price is truth itself. You might think you're immune to this. You might believe that you're rational, logical, objective. You might think that education and intelligence protect you from self-deception. But here's the terrifying reality that Feynman understood better than anyone. The smarter you are, the better you become at fooling yourself. The more educated you are, the more sophisticated your self-deception becomes. Intelligence isn't a shield against this illusion. It's a sword that cuts deeper into the fabric of reality, creating more elaborate, more convincing, more dangerous lies that we tell ourselves. Do you really think you see the world as it is? Do you honestly believe that when you look at evidence, when you analyze data, when you form conclusions, that you're being completely objective? Here's a question that should terrify every thinking person. How would you even know if you were deceiving yourself? How could you possibly detect a lie that you're telling yourself when your own mind is both the liar and the audience? This isn't just a philosophical puzzle. This is the central crisis of human knowledge, and Feynman saw it coming decades before anyone else understood just how deep this problem really runs. Most people think science is about discovering truth, but Feynman knew something darker and more complex. Science isn't primarily about finding truth. It's about not fooling yourself while you search for truth. It's about building defenses against the most cunning enemy you'll ever face, your own desperate need to be right. And here's what makes this enemy so dangerous. It doesn't feel like an enemy. It feels like insight. It feels like understanding. It feels like you're finally seeing clearly for the first time in your life. The illusion Feynman warned about isn't some abstract concept that only affects scientists in laboratories. It affects every decision you make, every opinion you form, every belief you hold. It's operating right now as you listen to these words, subtly shaping how you interpret what I'm saying, filtering my message through your pre-existing beliefs, making you more likely to accept ideas that confirm what you already think, and reject ideas that challenge your worldview. Even your reaction to this very statement is being influenced by the same psychological forces that Feynman identified as the greatest threat to scientific progress. But why is this illusion so powerful? Why does it persist even when we know about it? The answer lies in understanding how our minds actually work, not how we wish they worked or how we pretend they work, but how they really, truly, undeniably function when no one is watching and when our survival depends on making sense of a chaotic world. Let's start with a story that Feynman himself loved to tell, though he told it with a sense of humor that barely masked the profound unease it caused him. In the 1960s, at the height of his fame as a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Feynman was invited to observe some psychological research being conducted at his own university. The researchers were studying a phenomenon they called confirmation bias, though at the time they didn't yet understand just how fundamental this bias was to human cognition. They were running a simple experiment. They would show people a sequence of numbers and ask them to figure out the rule that governed the sequence. The sequence was 2, 4, 6. Simple enough, right? Most people immediately thought they saw the pattern, even numbers or numbers that increase by 2. So they would test their hypothesis by suggesting sequences like 8, 10, 12, or 4, 6, 8. The researcher would confirm, yes, these sequences follow the rule. The participants would become more confident. They had cracked the code. They understood the pattern. They were ready to announce their discovery. But here's where the story gets interesting, and here's where Feynman started to feel that familiar unease that told him he was witnessing something profound. The rule wasn't even numbers or numbers that increase by 2. The rule was much simpler and much more general. Any 3 numbers in ascending order. 1, 2, 3 would work. 5, 17, 2, 23 would work. 0, 1, 45, 1000 would work. Any ascending sequence satisfied the rule. The participants weren't wrong because they were stupid. They were wrong because they were smart. They were so smart that they immediately saw a pattern, and then they used their intelligence to confirm that pattern rather than to challenge it. They asked questions like, does 8, 10, 12 work? Instead of questions like, does 1, 3, 5 work? Or does 10, 8, 6 work? They looked for confirmation, not disconfirmation. They tried to prove themselves right, not prove themselves wrong. Feynman watched this experiment with growing fascination and horror. Here were intelligent people, educated people, people who prided themselves on rational thinking, and they were systematically deceiving themselves. But what made this observation truly terrifying for Feynman was the realization that he recognized this pattern. He had seen it before, not in psychology laboratories, but in physics laboratories. He had seen brilliant scientists, Nobel Prize winners, people whose minds could grasp the most complex mathematical relationships in the universe, fall into exactly the same trap. Think about what this means. These weren't people who lacked intelligence or education. These weren't people who didn't understand the scientific method. These were people who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge, and they were unconsciously sabotaging their own efforts. They were asking questions designed to confirm their beliefs rather than questions designed to test their beliefs. They were selecting evidence that supported their theories and ignoring evidence that challenged their theories. They were doing everything that science teaches us not to do, and they were doing it unconsciously, automatically, with complete confidence that they were being objective. But the story gets even worse. Feynman realized that this wasn't just happening to other people. This was happening to him. He started to examine his own research practices, his own thought processes, his own methods of analyzing data. What he found was deeply unsettling. Even knowing about confirmation bias, even being explicitly warned about the dangers of self-deception, even being one of the most methodologically rigorous scientists of his generation, he was still falling into the same traps. He was still unconsciously selecting data that confirmed his hypotheses and unconsciously overlooking data that challenged them. This led Feynman to a realization that would transform not just his own approach to science, but his understanding of what science actually is and how it actually works. Science isn't a method for discovering truth, at least not directly. Science is a method for avoiding self-deception. Every protocol in scientific research, every requirement for peer review, every demand for replication, every insistence on statistical significance, every rule about experimental design exists for one primary purpose: to protect scientists from themselves. Consider the double-blind study, one of the most important innovations in scientific methodology. In a double-blind study, neither the researcher nor the subject knows which treatment is real and which is a placebo. Why is this necessary? Because researchers unconsciously influence results. They unconsciously give subtle cues to subjects. They unconsciously interpret ambiguous data in ways that support their hypotheses. They unconsciously make measurement errors that favor their preferred outcomes. The double-blind study doesn't exist because researchers are dishonest. It exists because researchers are human. Before we dive deeper into this dangerous illusion, I want to ask you something. Have you ever noticed how certain ideas immediately make sense to you while others feel wrong from the start? Have you ever found yourself getting defensive when someone challenges a belief you hold strongly? That's your mind's confirmation bias system working in real time. But here's what I really want to know from you. Can you think of a time when you were absolutely certain about something, only to later discover you were completely wrong? What was that experience like? How did it feel to realize you had been fooling yourself? Share that story in the comments below, because understanding this psychological trap is the first step in defending against it. The deeper Feynman dug into this problem, the more unsettling it became. He wasn't just dealing with individual researchers making occasional mistakes. He was dealing with a systematic flaw in human cognition that was affecting entire fields of science. He started to see confirmation bias everywhere. In the way experiments were designed, in the way data was analyzed, in the way results were interpreted, in the way papers were written, in the way studies were funded, in the way careers were built. Take the case of Robert Millikan, one of the most celebrated physicists of the early 20th century. Millikan won the Nobel Prize for his oil drop experiment, which determined the charge of a single electron with unprecedented precision. It was a beautiful experiment, elegantly designed, meticulously executed, and it produced results that matched theoretical predictions almost perfectly. For decades, it was held up as an example of experimental physics at its finest. Textbooks praised Millikan's methodology. Students learned his techniques. His result became a fundamental constant of nature. But when historians later examined Millikan's notebooks, they discovered something troubling. Millikan hadn't published all of his data. He had performed 140 separate measurements of electron charge, but he only included 58 of them in his published results. The measurements he excluded were the ones that didn't fit his theoretical expectations. He had unconsciously, or perhaps consciously, selected only the data that confirmed what he thought the electron charge should be. Now here's the really disturbing part. Millikan's result was correct. The electron charge he measured and published was accurate to within experimental error. The measurements he excluded really were outliers caused by experimental problems. In some cosmic sense, Millikan had done the right thing by excluding bad data, but he had done it for the wrong reasons and in the wrong way. He hadn't excluded data based on objective criteria. He had excluded data that didn't match his expectations. He had let his theoretical beliefs guide his experimental analysis. This creates a paradox that Feynman found deeply troubling. How do you distinguish between legitimately excluding bad data and unconsciously excluding inconvenient data? How do you know when you're being scientifically rigorous and when you're fooling yourself? The answer isn't obvious, and that's what makes this illusion so dangerous. The very intelligence and expertise that makes someone a good scientist also makes them better at rationalizing their biases. Feynman saw this pattern repeated. throughout the history of science. Ptolemaic astronomers were brilliant mathematicians who created incredibly sophisticated models to explain planetary motion. Their models were complex, mathematically elegant, and they made accurate predictions, but they were also completely wrong about the fundamental structure of the solar system. The astronomers weren't stupid. They were trapped by their assumptions. They were so committed to the idea that Earth was the center of the universe that they kept adding epicycles to their models instead of questioning their basic premise. Similarly, phlogiston theorists in the 18th century weren't ignorant of chemistry. They were the leading chemists of their time. They developed elaborate theories about combustion and respiration that explained most of the phenomena they observed. When they encountered evidence that didn't fit their phlogiston model, they didn't abandon the model. They modified it. They made it more complex, more sophisticated, more capable of explaining away inconvenient observations. They were brilliant, educated, methodical scientists who were systematically deceiving themselves. This is what Feynman came to understand as the most dangerous illusion in science, the belief that intelligence and education protect us from self-deception. In reality, intelligence and education often make self-deception more sophisticated and more convincing. A brilliant person doesn't fool themselves in simple, obvious ways. They fool themselves in complex, subtle, almost undetectable ways. They create elaborate justifications for their biases. They develop sophisticated methods for avoiding inconvenient evidence. They become experts at lying to themselves. The quantum mechanics revolution provided Feynman with perhaps the clearest example of this phenomenon. In the early 20th century, physics was dominated by brilliant scientists who had spent their entire careers mastering classical mechanics. These weren't mediocre minds. They were giants of science. Albert Michelson, Lord Kelvin, Max Planck in his early years, these were people who understood the physical world better than perhaps any humans in history. And yet, when experimental evidence started to contradict classical physics, most of these brilliant scientists resisted the new evidence. They didn't resist it because they were stupid or stubborn. They resisted it because they had invested their entire intellectual identity in a particular way of understanding the world. They had built their careers, their reputations, their sense of self around classical physics. When evidence emerged that suggested classical physics was incomplete or incorrect, their minds unconsciously filtered that evidence. They found ways to explain away the black body radiation problem. They dismissed the photoelectric effect as an experimental artifact. They treated quantum effects as curiosities rather than fundamental features of nature. It took a new generation of scientists, people like Feynman himself, who hadn't invested their identities in classical physics, to fully embrace quantum mechanics. But even this new generation wasn't immune to the same cognitive traps. Feynman watched as brilliant quantum physicists became so attached to their interpretations of quantum mechanics that they stopped questioning fundamental assumptions. They became defensive when challenged. They started to sound more like priests defending doctrine than scientists testing hypotheses. This pattern led Feynman to formulate what he considered the first principle of scientific integrity. You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. This wasn't just a catchy saying or a philosophical observation. This was a practical warning based on decades of watching brilliant people deceive themselves in increasingly sophisticated ways. But understanding the problem was only the first step. Feynman realized that simply knowing about confirmation bias wasn't enough to protect against it. Even scientists who were explicitly taught about cognitive biases still fell victim to them. Even researchers who studied confirmation bias professionally were still subject to its effects in their own work. Knowledge alone wasn't sufficient. What was needed was a complete reimagining of how science is conducted. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the psychology of science and want to see more content that reveals the hidden dangers lurking in human thinking, hit that like button and subscribe for more eye-opening explorations of how our minds can deceive us even when we're trying our hardest to be rational and objective. This realization led Feynman to develop what he called cargo cult science, a term he borrowed from anthropology to describe research that looks scientific but lacks the essential spirit of true scientific inquiry. After World War II, anthropologists studied Pacific Islander communities that had been exposed to advanced military technology during the war. When the military left, some communities created elaborate imitations of the infrastructure they had seen: runways made of straw, control towers made of wood, radio equipment made of coconuts. They were performing all the visible aspects of military operations, but they were missing the essential elements that made those operations functional. Feynman saw the same pattern in scientific research. Researchers were performing all the visible aspects of science. They were designing experiments, collecting data, performing statistical analysis, publishing papers. But they were missing the essential element that made science functional, the genuine attempt to prove themselves wrong rather than right. They were going through the motions of scientific inquiry while unconsciously sabotaging their own efforts to discover truth. Take the famous example of ESP research in the 1970s and 1980s. Serious scientists with impressive credentials and rigorous experimental designs conducted thousands of studies testing whether humans had extrasensory perception. They used sophisticated statistical methods. They controlled for known biases. They published their results in peer-reviewed journals. By all external measures, this was legitimate scientific research, but Feynman recognized it as cargo cult science because the researchers were unconsciously designing their experiments to find evidence for ESP rather than to test whether ESP existed. The problem wasn't that these researchers were dishonest or incompetent. The problem was that they wanted ESP to be real. They were psychologically invested in the outcome of their research. This investment created unconscious biases that affected every aspect of their work: how they selected subjects, how they designed protocols, how they analyzed data, how they interpreted results. They weren't consciously cheating. They were unconsciously optimizing their research to produce the results they hoped to find. Feynman contrasted this with genuine scientific research, where the investigator's goal is not to confirm a preferred hypothesis, but to determine what is actually true, regardless of personal preferences or theoretical commitments. In genuine science, a negative result is just as valuable as a positive result. In genuine science, the most important question isn't how can I prove my theory, but how can I test whether my theory might be wrong? This distinction seems simple, but implementing it is extraordinarily difficult because it requires fighting against fundamental aspects of human psychology. Our brains are pattern recognition machines that evolved to find meaningful connections in complex environments. This ability kept our ancestors alive by helping them recognize predators, locate food sources, and navigate social relationships. But in the context of scientific research, this same ability becomes a liability because it makes us see patterns where none exist and find meaning in random data. Consider the case of N-rays, a form of radiation that was discovered by French physicist René Blondelot in 1903. Blondelot was a respected scientist at the University of Nancy, and his discovery generated enormous excitement in the scientific community. Dozens of other researchers confirmed his findings. More than 300 papers were published describing N-ray experiments. The French Academy of Sciences awarded Blondelot a prestigious prize for his discovery. But N-rays didn't exist. They were a collective delusion created by confirmation bias and wishful thinking. The effects that researchers observed were subtle changes in the brightness of barely visible light sources. These changes were so small that they required enormous concentration to detect, which meant that researchers were unconsciously influencing what they saw based on their expectations. The illusion was finally shattered when American physicist Robert Wood visited Blondelot's laboratory and secretly removed a crucial prism from the experimental apparatus. Even without the prism, which was supposedly essential for detecting N-rays, Blondlot continued to observe the same effects he had been reporting. When Wood revealed what he had done, the N-ray delusion collapsed almost overnight. But here's what makes this story particularly troubling. The dozens of scientists who had confirmed Blondlot's findings weren't lying or incompetent. They were experiencing genuine perceptions that felt completely real to them. Feynman used stories like this to illustrate a fundamental point about human perception. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as our brains construct it from sensory data, prior expectations, and unconscious assumptions. This construction process is usually accurate enough for daily life, but it becomes problematic in scientific contexts where subtle effects and small differences can be crucial. The solution Feynman proposed wasn't to try to eliminate bias, he knew that was impossible, but to create systems and protocols that made bias visible and correctable. He advocated for what he called leaning over backwards to ensure experimental integrity. This meant actively looking for reasons why your results might be wrong, systematically testing alternative explanations for your observations, and designing experiments that could easily prove your hypothesis false if it was indeed false. One of Feynman's favorite examples of this approach came from his own research on liquid helium. In the 1950s, he was studying the strange behavior of helium at extremely low temperatures, trying to understand why it seemed to flow without friction. Feynman had developed a theoretical explanation for this phenomenon, and he designed experiments to test his theory. But instead of looking for evidence that confirmed his explanation, he spent most of his time trying to design experiments that would definitively disprove it. He would ask himself, if my theory is wrong, what should I observe? Then he would design experiments specifically to look for those observations. He would intentionally vary experimental conditions in ways that should reveal flaws in his reasoning. He would collaborate with researchers who disagreed with his theoretical approach, specifically because they would be motivated to find problems with his work that he might miss. This approach felt deeply unnatural to Feynman because it required fighting against every instinct that had made him successful as a scientist. His pattern recognition abilities, his theoretical intuition, his confidence in his own reasoning, all of these became potential enemies rather than allies. But this unnatural approach was exactly what was needed to avoid the trap of self-deception. The implications of Feynman's insights extend far beyond scientific research into every domain of human knowledge and decision-making. In medicine, confirmation bias leads doctors to anchor on initial diagnoses and miss alternative explanations for symptoms. In business, it leads managers to ignore evidence that challenges their strategic assumptions. In politics, it leads people to consume only information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs. In personal relationships, it leads us to interpret ambiguous behavior in ways that confirm our existing feelings about people. Understanding this illusion is particularly crucial in our current information environment, where we have unprecedented access to data, but also unprecedented ability to filter that data according to our preferences. Search engines, social media algorithms, and personalized news feeds all amplify our natural tendency toward confirmation bias by showing us information that matches our interests and beliefs while filtering out information that challenges them. Feynman's warning about self-deception has become more relevant, not less relevant, as technology has advanced. The same tools that give us access to vast amounts of information also make it easier to live in bubbles of self-confirming beliefs. The same algorithms that help us find relevant information also help us avoid uncomfortable truths. The same networks that connect us to like-minded people also insulate us from perspectives that might challenge our assumptions. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this illusion is that it feels like clarity. When we're in the grip of confirmation bias, we don't feel confused or uncertain. We feel like we're finally seeing clearly, like pieces of a puzzle are falling into place, like everything makes perfect sense. The danger isn't that bias makes us feel stupid. The danger is that bias makes us feel smart. It gives us the psychological reward of understanding without the actual burden of accuracy. This is why Feynman's first principle, that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool, remains the most important lesson in the history of human knowledge. It's not just a warning about scientific research, it's a warning about the fundamental challenge of being human in a complex world. Our minds are powerful tools for understanding reality, but they're also powerful tools for creating convincing illusions. The difference between wisdom and delusion often comes down to whether we're using our intelligence to seek truth or to avoid it. The most dangerous illusion in science isn't some abstract philosophical problem that only affects researchers in laboratories. It's a daily challenge that affects every person who wants to understand the world accurately and make decisions based on reality rather than wishful thinking. Feynman's warning reminds us that the price of knowledge is eternal vigilance, not just against external sources of misinformation, but against our own mind's desperate desire to be right, even when being right means being wrong about reality. The journey from simple pattern recognition to profound self-deception is shorter than we want to admit, and the only protection against this journey is the willingness to question ourselves more rigorously than we question anything else. In a world full of complex problems and competing explanations, the most dangerous person to trust is the one who never doubts themselves. The most reliable knowledge comes from those who have learned to be suspicious of their own certainty. This understanding transforms how we think about intelligence, expertise, and authority. The smartest person in the room isn't the one with the most confident opinions. It's the one who maintains the most rigorous doubt about their own conclusions. The most trustworthy expert isn't the one who never changes their mind. It's the one who changes their mind when evidence demands it, even when that change is uncomfortable or costly. Feynman's legacy isn't just his contributions to physics or his colorful personality or his gift for explanation. His legacy is a warning that echoes across decades. In our search for truth, our greatest enemy is ourselves, and our most powerful tool for finding reality is our willingness to question whether we've already found it. In a universe full of mysteries, the greatest mystery remains the human mind's ability to deceive itself so completely that deception feels like discovery. Understanding this illusion doesn't make us immune to it, but it gives us a fighting chance against the most dangerous enemy we'll ever face, our own certainty that we already know what we need to know. Educational note. This content combines scientifically accurate information about confirmation bias and Richard Feynman's actual insights with educational storytelling and entertainment to illustrate important principles about human psychology and scientific methodology.